In the early hours of December 23, 1941, the skies above Rangoon erupted into a symphony of destruction that would echo across the entire Asian continent. Below, in the bustling streets of Burma's colonial capital, merchants hawked their wares while dock workers loaded precious cargo bound for China. None of them knew that within moments, their world would be shattered by falling bombs and roaring engines. This was not just another air raid. This was the opening movement of a campaign that would sever China's lifeline, topple an empire, and reshape the balance of power across Asia forever. The Japanese bombers descended like steel vultures, their engines drowning out the morning prayers from Buddhist temples. High explosive and incendiary bombs rained down upon the wooden buildings, turning entire city blocks into towering infernos. Glass shattered, walls collapsed, and the screams of terrified civilians filled the air as they stampeded through smoke-choked streets. An Indian shopkeeper who witnessed the carnage described the horror in haunting terms. It was a pitiable sight to see women with disheveled hair and babies in their arms, crying and running wherever their fear took them. Children clung desperately to strangers, mistaking them for their parents in the chaos. By the time the last bomber disappeared into the horizon, over 3/5 of Rangoon's wooden structures lay in ruins. The docks, the lifeblood of the city's economy, sat paralyzed as workers fled into the surrounding jungles. Public transport ground to a halt. The civil defense services collapsed as their own staff abandoned their posts. Columns of smoke drifted skyward over what had once been the jewel of British Burma. In a single morning, the Japanese had delivered a message that resonated far beyond the burning city limits. The age of European dominance in Southeast Asia was ending, but Rangoon was more than just another colonial outpost. It was the key to a vast strategic puzzle that stretched from the mountains of China to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Through its bustling port flowed the supplies that kept Chinese resistance alive against Japanese occupation. The Burma Road, that serpentine lifeline carved through mountain passes and river valleys, connected Rangoon's docks to the Chinese city of Kunming. Every truck that rumbled along its 717 miles carried ammunition, fuel, and hope to Chiang Kai-shek's beleaguered forces. For the Japanese, controlling Rangoon meant strangling China's last remaining supply route and securing their southern flank for the greater conquest to come. The man tasked with seizing this prize was General Shojiro Ida, commander of the Japanese 15th Army. His forces had already proven their worth in the lightning conquest of Malaya, where British defenders had crumbled before the relentless advance of Japanese infantry and armor. Now Ida prepared to unleash that same fury upon Burma, confident that the demoralized defenders would offer little more resistance than their comrades in Singapore. His plan was elegantly simple: strike from multiple directions, overwhelm the scattered British garrisons, and capture Rangoon before the enemy could mount an effective defense. The Japanese advance began like a carefully choreographed dance of destruction. On January 16, 1942, a Japanese battalion seized Victoria Point at Burma's southern tip, capturing their first airfield inside the country. 3 days later, Tavoy fell, followed quickly by Mergui. Each captured airfield brought Japanese bombers closer to Rangoon, shortening their flight time and increasing the frequency of raids. The noose was tightening around the colonial capital with methodical precision. Meanwhile, the main assault force prepared to cross the Thai border near Rahang. Lieutenant General Takeshi Koga's 55th Division had spent weeks positioning itself for this moment, gathering intelligence and coordinating with an unlikely ally. The Burma Independence Army, led by a young revolutionary named Aung San, had thrown their lot in with the Japanese invaders. These Burmese nationalists saw the war as their chance to throw off the yoke of British colonial rule and establish an independent nation. Aung San himself was a fascinating figure, a student activist who had transformed himself into a military leader through sheer force of will. In December 1941, at a ceremony in Bangkok, he had watched as blood was drawn from the arms of the legendary 30 comrades and mixed with liquor in a silver bowl. This ancient Burmese ritual bound them together in eternal loyalty to their cause and to each other. When the Burma Independence Army officially formed, Aung San took his place as senior staff officer, ready to lead his countrymen in what they believed would be a war of liberation. As Japanese forces prepared for their main assault, the skies above Rangoon continued to burn. The colonial authorities had managed to scrape together a modest air defense, including a squadron of the famous American volunteer group known as the Flying Tigers. These pilots, authorized by President Roosevelt to support China while remained officially America neutral, flew their distinctive shark-nosed P-40 Tomahawks with deadly skill. Though vastly outnumbered, they managed to shoot down 50 Japanese aircraft over Rangoon, losing only 10 of their own in the process. But courage alone could not overcome the mathematics of war. As the Japanese captured more airfields in southern Burma, their bombers needed less warning time to reach Rangoon. The defenders found themselves fighting an increasingly desperate battle against overwhelming odds. Each day brought fresh raids, fresh destruction, and fresh waves of refugees fleeing northward toward what they hoped would be safety. The human cost of this aerial campaign was staggering. Conservative estimates put civilian deaths at over 1,000, though the true number may have been twice as high. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, their wooden structures no match for Japanese incendiary bombs. The downtown districts, once bustling with commerce and life, became charred wastelands where the dead lay uncollected in the tropical heat. Governor Dorman Smith toured the devastation that afternoon, surveying the price of empire in an age of total war. On January 22, 1942, the ground war began in earnest. General Koga's 55th Division crossed the border at Kaukarake Pass, brushing aside the 16th Indian Infantry Brigade with contemptuous ease. The British defenders, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the assault, retreated hastily westward. Their next stand would be at Mulmine, the ancient port city at the mouth of the Salween River. But even there, squeezed into an impossible defensive position with the river at their backs, they could only delay the inevitable. The 2nd Burma Infantry Brigade found itself trapped in a shrinking perimeter as Japanese forces closed in from all sides. Artillery shells rained down upon their positions while enemy infantry probed for weaknesses in their lines. By January 31st, the situation had become hopeless. Under cover of darkness, the surviving defenders retreated across the Salween River by ferry, abandoning vast quantities of supplies and equipment. Some unlucky souls who missed the last boats were forced to swim the mile-and-a-half width of the river, many drowning in the attempt. With Mulmine in Japanese hands, the path to Rangoon lay open. General Ida's forces had broken through the first line of defense with shocking ease, capturing airfields, ports, and strategic positions along the way. The Burma Independence Army swelled with new recruits as news of Japanese victories spread, and their activities behind British lines added to the chaos and confusion. Local administration collapsed in occupied areas as Burmese nationalists took control, often settling old scores with ethnic minorities they viewed as British collaborators. The stage was set for the final act of this unfolding drama. Rangoon, battered by weeks of bombing and surrounded by advancing enemy forces, prepared for siege. The fate of Burma, of China's supply line, and of British prestige in Asia hung in the balance as two armies moved inexorably toward their appointment with destiny. The British commanders in Rangoon found themselves staring into the abyss of military disaster. General Thomas Hutton, commander of Burma Army, paced the corridors of Government House as reports flooded in from the collapsing front lines. Each dispatch brought worse news than the last. Japanese forces were advancing faster than anyone had thought possible, their tactics proving devastatingly effective against defenders who had grown complacent during years of colonial peace. The empire that had once seemed unshakable was cracking under pressure, its weaknesses exposed by an enemy who fought with fanatical determination. The defense of Burma rested on pitifully few shoulders. The 17th Indian Division, supposedly the backbone of British resistance, was stretched impossibly thin across hundreds of miles of jungle and mountain terrain. These men, many of them raw recruits with minimal combat experience, faced seasoned Japanese veterans who had honed their skills in the brutal campaigns of China. The odds were never equal, but now they had become hopeless. As February dawned, the Japanese noose tightened around the remaining British strongholds. The next major obstacle in their path was the Bilin River, where British engineers had prepared defensive positions they hoped might slow the enemy advance. But hope proved a fragile thing in the face of Japanese tactical superiority. Between February 14th and 19th, the defenders fought desperately to hold their line, but superior numbers and aggressive flanking maneuvers gradually wore down their resistance. The British strategy, if it could be called that, consisted of a series of fighting withdrawals from one river line to the next. Each retreat was meant to buy time for reinforcements that never seemed to arrive in sufficient numbers. The 17th Indian Division found itself constantly outflanked by Japanese forces who moved through terrain the British had considered impassable. Dense jungle that should have been an obstacle became a highway for enemy infiltration as Japanese soldiers, many of them veterans of jungle warfare in China, demonstrated their mastery of unconventional tactics. Behind the crumbling front lines, panic gripped the civilian population. The exodus that had begun with the first bombing raids now became a flood of humanity streaming northward toward India. Hundreds of thousands of Indians, Anglo-Indians, and Anglo-Burmese abandoned everything they had built in Burma, carrying only what they could manage on foot. The roads became clogged with refugees, their possessions piled high on bullock carts or balanced precariously on their heads. Children wailed in the tropical heat, while their parents searched desperately for food and water along the overcrowded evacuation routes. The refugee crisis added another layer of complexity to the military disaster unfolding across Burma. Supply lines that should have been feeding British troops instead groaned under the weight of civilian evacuation. Administrative systems collapsed as colonial officials fled alongside the people they were supposed to govern. In some areas, law and order broke down completely, leaving communities to fend for themselves against bandits and the advancing enemy. By late February, the British position had become untenable. The Japanese advance had reached the Sittang River, the last major natural barrier before Rangoon itself. Here, if anywhere, the defenders might make a stand that could buy precious time for the capital's defenses. The 17th Indian Division, battered and demoralized from weeks of continuous retreat, prepared to face their pursuers once more. But the Japanese had no intention of allowing their enemies to regroup and fortify. The battle for the Sittang Bridge would become one of the most controversial episodes of the entire Burma campaign. Major General Jackie Smith, the divisional commander, found his forces in general disorder as they approached the vital crossing point. Japanese infiltration tactics had sown chaos in the British rear areas, with enemy soldiers appearing where they were least expected. The retreat itself became a nightmare of broken vehicles, air attacks, and constant harassment by Japanese advance guards who seemed to materialize from the jungle like ghosts. As dawn broke on February 23rd, 1942, Smith faced an impossible decision. Japanese forces had infiltrated to the bridge itself, threatening to capture it intact and use it to pour across the river toward Rangoon. The poorly organized defense was crumbling under pressure, and there seemed no way to prevent the bridge from falling into enemy hands. In a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Smythe gave the order that would seal the fate of his division and perhaps of Rangoon itself. The explosion that destroyed the Sittang Bridge reverberated across the river valley like thunder, sending chunks of concrete and twisted steel cascading into the muddy waters below. But the blast also trapped the majority of the 17th Indian Division on the wrong side of the river, in territory now firmly controlled by advancing Japanese forces. Men who had fought bravely for weeks suddenly found themselves cut off from their own lines, forced to abandon their heavy equipment and attempt desperate river crossings under enemy fire. The human cost of the Sittang disaster was catastrophic. While most of the division's personnel eventually made it across the river, they arrived as stragglers rather than soldiers, their units shattered and their equipment lost. The 17th Indian Division, once the main hope for Burma's defense, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The road to Rangoon now lay wide open, with only scattered remnants standing between the Japanese and their prize. News of the Sittang Bridge disaster sent shockwaves through the British command structure. General Wavell in India recognized that the situation had moved beyond recovery, while in London, Churchill struggled to comprehend how his forces could have collapsed so quickly. The myth of European military superiority, already badly damaged by events in Malaya and Singapore, suffered another devastating blow. Asian armies, it seemed, could not only match European forces, but decisively defeat them. In Rangoon, the remaining defenders prepared for what they knew would be their final stand. The 63rd Indian Brigade had arrived to reinforce the city's garrison, along with 3 British battalions and the 7th Armoured Brigade. But these reinforcements, impressive on paper, could not mask the fundamental weakness of the British position. Cut off from their main supply bases, and facing an enemy whose confidence grew with each victory, they were fighting a battle they could not win. General Alexander, who had replaced Hutton in a desperate last-minute command change, surveyed the wreckage of British hopes in Burma. A veteran of many campaigns, he understood immediately that Rangoon could. The question not be hell was no longer whether the city would fall, But whether anything could be salvaged from the disaster, his decision to evacuate would spare his forces from encirclement and destruction, but it would also hand the Japanese their greatest strategic prize in Southeast Asia. The morning of March 7th dawned grey and smoky over Rangoon as British engineers put the torch to everything they could not carry. The harbour that had once bustled with merchant vessels and cargo ships now echoed with the thunder of demolitions. Oil storage tanks erupted in towering pillars of flame that cast an orange glow across the city skyline. The railway yards, where locomotives had once pulled trainloads of supplies toward China, became twisted graveyards of steel and concrete. Warehouses packed with rubber, rice, and precious metals vanished in controlled explosions that shook windows miles away. Alexander's scorched earth policy was methodical and merciless. Every asset that might aid the Japanese war effort had to be destroyed, no matter the cost to Burma's future. The great docks where generations of colonial administrators had first set foot on Burmese soil crumbled under precisely placed charges. Oil refineries that had powered the colony's economy became infernos visible from the horizon. Even the government buildings, symbols of British authority for over half a century, were stripped of anything valuable before being left to their fate. The evacuation itself resembled a carefully orchestrated retreat from hell. Military convoys snaked through streets littered with debris from weeks of bombing, their engines competing with the roar of distant explosions. Staff cars carried the last colonial officials northward, while trucks groaned under the weight of essential supplies and equipment. Behind them, the city they abandoned burned like a funeral pyre for the British Empire in Southeast Asia. Among the refugees streaming north were the remnants of once proud military units, their regimental colours furled and their ranks decimated by weeks of continuous fighting. These men had enlisted to serve the Crown in what they believed would be a peaceful colonial posting. Instead, they found themselves part of the longest fighting withdrawal in British military history, a retreat that would stretch 900 miles across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Japanese entry into Rangoon on March 8th was a moment of triumph that resonated across the Asian continent. General Ida's troops marched through streets still reeking of smoke and destruction, their rising sun banners snapping in the wind above a city that had symbolized Western dominance for generations. The cameras that recorded their victory parade captured more than military conquest. They documented the birth in Asia, one where European of a new order powers could no longer assume their supremacy was guaranteed by the color of their skin or the weight of their history. For the Burma Independence Army, the Fall of Rangoon represented vindication of their gamble on Japanese support. Aung San and his followers had bet everything on the belief that collaboration with the invaders would lead to genuine independence. As they helped establish control over the captured city, they began the delicate process of transforming military victory into political reality. The dream of a free Burma seemed within reach, though the price paid in blood and collaboration would haunt the nation for decades to come. The strategic implications of Rangoon's capture rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. In Chongqing, Chiang Kai-shek received the news with grim resignation, knowing that his last reliable supply line to the outside world had been severed. Chinese forces that had depended on American and British aid delivered through Burma's ports would now have to make do with whatever could be flown over the Himalayas, a dangerous and expensive proposition that could never match the volume of supplies that had flowed along the Burma Road. In Tokyo, military planners celebrated the completion of their southern strategy's first phase. The capture of Rangoon had secured their flank and eliminated a major threat to their newly conquered territories in Southeast Asia. More importantly, it had demonstrated once again the superiority of Japanese military doctrine over European colonial forces. The psychological impact of victory after victory was creating that seem a momentumed unstoppable, feeding dreams of an empire that would stretch from the Aleutian Islands to the gates of India. But victory in Rangoon was only the beginning of Japan's ambitions in Burma. The retreating British forces under Alexander's command were not destroyed, merely displaced. Somewhere in the jungles and mountains to the north, they were regrouping and preparing for the next phase of the campaign. The Burma Road might be cut, but as long as Allied forces remained in the region, the threat of its reopening would persist. The Japanese would have to pursue their enemies into terrain that favored defenders over attackers, launching a campaign that would test their logistics and endurance to the breaking point. The human cost of Rangoon's fall extended far beyond military casualties. The estimated 600,000 refugees who fled Burma during this period represented one of the largest population movements in Southeast Asian history. These were not just statistics but individual tragedies, families torn apart by war and forced to abandon everything they had built over generations. Indian merchants who had prospered under British rule found themselves walking barefoot through jungle paths, carrying their children and whatever possessions they could manage who would serve. Anglo-Burmese families, the colonial Burmese nationalists seeking enforced heritage, made them targets for both Japanese occupation and collaboration of perceived administration, discovered that their mixed revenge, for decades its create, the exudusarvation, and the element's own form of warfare. St. Disease battle against that claimed dysentery spread through refugee than medical camps faster. 000 lives, Cholrad 80, and estimated and arms along distributed. Children died in their mothers' grave supplies could be muddy trails that became our life. The Mons dreams colonial peaceful affanes that began yards Ford evac in May, ternuation routes into rivers of mud, weak drowning thurned. The journey to India arrive who survive the strong, those and exhausters serving hollow windows of an collapse, their stories-eyed Rem empires as testimony to the true cost of military defeat. The Fall of Rangoon also marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain and its Asian subjects. The myth of European invincibility, already damaged by Japanese victories in Malaya and Singapore, lay in ruins among the bombed-out buildings of Burma's capital. Local populations across the region watched with fascination as white colonial administrators fled in panic before Asian armies. The psychological foundations of imperial rule, built on assumptions of racial and cultural superiority, cracked under the weight of military reality. In India, nationalist leaders like Gandhi and Nehru observed these events with complex emotions. While they had no love for Japanese militarism, they could not ignore the symbolic power of Asian forces defeating European armies. The British Raj, which had seemed eternal and unshakable, suddenly appeared vulnerable to pressure from multiple directions. The seeds of independence movements across Asia found fertile ground in the wreckage of colonial prestige, growing into challenges that would reshape the continent's political landscape for generations to come. The Japanese occupation of Rangoon also revealed the complex nature of collaboration and resistance in wartime Asia. The independence armies with the In-Burma Cooperation Aiders was motivated by genuine aspirations for national freedom, but it also involved complicity in atrocities committed against ethnic minorities. Karen, Shan, and other communities that had maintained loyalty to British rule found themselves targeted for reprisals by Burmese nationalists seeking to settle old scores. The violence that followed Japanese victory demonstrated how quickly liberation could transform into instruments of ethnic movements' persecution. Meanwhile, in the jungles and mountains where British forces regged different troops, a kind of transformation was taking place. Officers who had learned their trade in the clubs and cantonments of peacetime India were discovering the harsh realities of modern warfare. The comfortable assumptions of colonial military service, where native troops provided labor while British officers provided leadership, gave way to a more democratic understanding of survival. Rank mattered less than competence in the jungle, and many young subalterns found themselves learning tactics from experienced Indian and Burmese soldiers who understood the terrain better than any staff college graduate. The retreat itself became a crucible that forged new forms of military cooperation between races and nations that had previously maintained strict hierarchies. British, Indian, Chinese, and American forces found themselves depending on each other for survival in ways that colonial society had never permitted. These relationships, born of necessity and tempered by shared hardship, would prove crucial in the campaigns to come. The army that eventually returned to reclaim Burma would be fundamentally different from the one that had fled in defeat, transformed by defeat into something more formidable than victory had ever made it. As March gave way to April and the monsoon season approached, the full scope of the disaster in Burma became apparent to strategists in London, Washington, and New Delhi. The Japanese had achieved in 3 months what many experts had believed impossible. They had not merely captured territory but had shattered the psychological foundations of Western power in Asia. The road back to Rangoon would be long and bloody, requiring resources and determination that would test the Allied cause to its limits. The Fall of Rangoon on March 8, 1942, marked more than the capture of a colonial capital. It shattered the myth of Western invincibility, severed China's lifeline, and unleashed forces that would reshape Asia forever. From the ashes of defeat rose new nations, new alliances, and new understanding of what was possible when empires collided. The siege that lasted mere months created consequences that echo still today, proving that sometimes a single battle can indeed change the course of continents.